In the last video, we looked at how to create a breakpoint. However, when creating your sound, the breakpoint is only half the story. To create a more dynamic sound, you need to use the breakpoints as morphing points to step between, allowing you to create a story of different sounds that are strung together as a series. In Morphine, this is known as a spectrum. As you can see, I already have a sound set up in the breakpoint editor. To add another breakpoint, you have to change your focus to the spectrum editor. And all we have to do is right or alt-click in the blank area of this editor, and this will create a new node with the vertical axis determining the amplitude of that breakpoint, and the horizontal axis acting as the time ruler. The new node can then be moved about these axes by click-dragging the node itself. This breakpoint can then be adjusted the same way as the original breakpoint. If we now play a note, what you'll hear is the first breakpoint morphing over time into the second breakpoint. The amount of time this takes is determined by how far along the timeline's second mode is. You can then add even more breakpoints to build up your spectrum. The timeline along the bottom displays the time in seconds, or beats if you have the tempo sync button turned on. If you need to see the times for those that are beyond the display, you can simply click to drag on the timeline and move left or right. The last note in your selection determines how the note is held at the end of the spectrum envelope, unless you set loop points. The loop's start and end points can be adjusted by using these markers here. When it comes to looping a section of the spectrum, there are 4 different loop settings that you can select from: off, forward, backward, and ping pong. With this set to off, the spectrum will ignore the loop points altogether. And when you set it to forward, the envelope will play through till the end of the loop point, then jump back to the loop's start point, then play the loop again and again until a note off message is received. A setting of backwards will mean that the first time it reaches the loop endpoint, it will play backwards to the loop's start point. Then jump back to the loop's endpoint and continue to play backwards. Finally, ping pong means the loop section will play alternatively, backwards and forwards as long as the key is pressed. Normally, when you stop pressing a key on your keyboard, it'll just continue from the point in the timeline that you're currently at, through the various nodes to the endpoint. However, if you activate this button here, then it'll jump to the breakpoint immediately after reaching the final loop point. One of the uses for this is if you have a particularly long loop section, for example on a soundscape. Then when you release the key, you may have to wait some time for the sound to end, so activating this button will prevent this from happening. You also have these 3 controls up here. These control the rates at which Morphine will play through the spectrum itself. The rate control can make Morphine play through a series of breakpoints faster by adjusting it to the right, or slower by adjusting it to the left. The next 2 controls determines the rate at which Morphine plays through the spectrum, dependent on the velocity and the pitch of the key played. By turning the key track control left or right, you can control the rate at which Morphine plays through the spectrum by changing the pitch that you play on your keyboard. So at lower pitches, it'll play faster, and at higher pitches, it'll play slower. Similarly, with the V-track control, the velocity of the notes struck will determine the speed at which the spectrum is played. By now you should have grasped the enormous amounts of customization that is available to you. However, it doesn't stop there. This last section of the generator allows you to map different spectra across different regions of the keyboard. You can go ahead and make each key play a different sound, in a similar manner to a sampler, minus any velocity layers. After all this, you can then go ahead and program another series of sounds in each of Morphine's 4 generators. For those that find this would be a difficult way to create sounds in Morphine, You'll be glad to hear that to create your own patches, you do not need to generate all your sounds from scratch. In the next section of video, we'll look at an easier way to get sounds from Morphine, resynthesis, as well as looking at the Morph Mix control.